And joining us this morning is international psychologist Dr. Anjhula Mya. Good morning, Doc.
Good morning.
Good morning. Okay, now a bit shocking, but we've been reading about this case in not just social media, but it's now in print media as well, about how a volunteer has been sort of targeting young girls for many, many years and given, them explicit messages on WhatsApp and whatnot. So, I mean, without going into too much detail, this has been going on for ages. I remember being a kid in school and my friends showing me letters they've received from men. And I was like, how did you meet these men? Oh, they're loitering outside the school gates. And while we're waiting for a bus, notes are being passed around. And I guess this is a phenomena that is just kind of timeless, isn't it, Dr. Anjhula?
It is. I mean, the medium changes, but some things, unfortunately, seem to be timeless.
So I guess what we want to know is how can we empower children to recognize when a seemingly inconspicuous conversation is taking a dodgy turn?
Right. So, I mean, in instances like this, I think prevention is the name of the game. It's obviously more desirable than cure. So, for example, when we're talking about sexual abuse, how we train children to understand that is, if it feels wrong, it's wrong. Obviously, grooming online, hopefully it doesn't get to the area of touch, but how you empower your children is actually sort of providing a sexual education. What is off limits? What is normal? When someone starts asking you about personal details, being flirtatious, getting into sort of a sexual landscape, a lot of groomers start with flattering. You're cute, you're funny, so on and so forth. All of these things can be talked to your child about, but what's also really imperative overall is, a lot of times in parenting, it can be hard. We get tired. We may yell at our kids. We may not have time. So children feel isolated, so they gravitate towards an adult that seems very understanding, that's there for them, that provides companionship. So really early on, establishing a relationship with your child where you can tell me anything and I'll be there for you and I believe you is paramount in educating.
Right. And also, maybe reminding your children there's no reason why a full-grown adult male, in this instance, in a lot of instances, should have any reason to get to know you as a friend. So I'd like to know you as a friend.
100%. If you're in person, I mean, telling your child that anybody who wants to touch you, for example, in the chest area or, below the waist, that is completely inappropriate unless it's a medical doctor. Similarly, you can set those kind of guidelines with your children for online behavior.
Well, just as much as it's important to empower the children, how do we empower parents to deal with these situations? We'll get into that as we continue Mind Matters this morning at the Paul Young on Lite. This morning, it's Mind Matters with international psychologist Dr. Anjhula Mya. And in light of recent grooming cases on chat messaging and social media, we're discussing this morning about how parents and children can empower themselves to deal with these threats.
Now, Dr. Anjhula, some parents may find it hard to believe or not overreact. And some are even in denial when their children attempt to explain these encounters to them. How should parents respond to their children when this happens?
When parents don't believe their children, it can be very, very detrimental in the sense that children shut down, or they might communicate further with a predator because they feel heard, they feel seen. A lot of times it's not about shutting down the child or yelling, I don't have time, I don't believe you, but more about what is their behavior, what are they saying, what are the feelings behind that, where are they going with this? Children are much less likely to lie about these things. There's no motivation to lie about something like this, right? What parents can do is really, really educate themselves, because it's a very, very different landscape than to probably when they grew up. One good tool is the online grooming communication project, which is a very comprehensive site that has a lot of research. There's a lot of social myths, like for example, online groomers pretend to be children. Not really. In most cases, they have let the children know that they're an adult. They might have shaved off 4 or 5 years off their age, but they're not trying to fool the children by masquerading as another child or another teen. There's usually 3 phases, which is, access, entrapment. And access is pretty pretty simple. Like, you're cute, how are you? But entrapment involves things like testing, how willing the child is to comply with orders.
Like, send me a picture.
Absolutely. How isolated they are, and the final goal obviously is sexual gratification. 75% of children who are, sort of preyed upon are females. And some of the things parents can look out for is, if they know that their children suffer from low self-esteem or have long hours online, those are warning risks.
Well, there's so much choice in terms of social media and channels to use. I mean, how do we teach children to use those channels wisely? We'll get into those details next on My Matters on Lite. So in light of recent news of grooming happening through chat messaging, this morning we're discussing how parents and children can empower themselves to protect themselves from these threats.
Now, Dr. Anjhula, how should we educate children to approach social media channels wisely?
So, whether it's about online bullying, whether it's about predators and grooming, there are several tips. Be your own person. Don't let friends or strangers pressure you to be someone that you aren't. Obviously, be nice online. You want to treat people the way you'd want to be treated. If you see someone that's kind of going down the slippery line of either being mean or being overtly sexual, you can use privacy tools to block them. Think about what you post. So sharing provocative photos or sort of intimate details online, even let's say in emails, can cause problems later on because people are not necessarily going to remain your friends, or circumstances and things change. Remember that your passwords are private. Don't share that, not even with friends. Also, learn to read between the lines. So, it might be fun to sort of check out new people for friendship or romance, but, you need to be aware that even though some people are being nice, sometimes they might be trying to get something.
Right.
Don't talk about sex with strangers. You want to be cautious when you're communicating with people you don't know in person, especially if the conversation starts to be about sex or physical acts. You don't want to lead them on because you could be a target of a predator's grooming.
Okay.
Well, in some situations, these things can really take a turn for the worse, and we want to find out, how do children overcome the trauma from these uncomfortable encounters? We'll get into that on My Matters after Starship on Lite. So in light of recent stories of grooming happening through chat messaging apps, we're discussing this morning how parents and children can empower themselves to deal with these threats.
Now, there were quite a number of girls who came forward with regards to this specific case and said, he's been doing this for years and they're still, thinking about it. They're a bit traumatized by it. So if you have undergone something like this, how do you overcome the trauma from these uncomfortable encounters?
Well, having a support network in place is very important, and that support network should try to include things like, unconditional acceptance, no judgment, empathetic listening, attunement, and, the power of belief. When these young people are coming forth with their stories, that takes a lot of bravery, it takes a lot of courage, and it's up to us as adults to believe them and say, your story has a place and I'm listening. For that to be disregarded or dismissed can be as traumatizing, if not more, sort of a secondary trauma. Therapy is extremely beneficial. A lot of times victims blame themselves, what's wrong with me? If only I hadn't worn this, or I haven't shared this, or I was stupid. But it's not a child or a young person's fault. Obviously adults should and can do better. So therapy is very, very helpful in dispelling cognitive distortions and helping heal trauma, a safe space for listening, teaching coping skills, and also modeling what a safe relationship with an adult looks like.
It's interesting that sometimes parents don't respond in the right manner. I had a friend who relayed this to me about how when we were teenagers, and she was in this situation, and when she told her parents about it afterwards, she was basically blamed for the whole thing. Like, there you go, you go talk to every Tom, Dick, and Harry out there. This is what happens. So it's victim blaming. And when you don't get the support like that at home, what can you do?
Well, you bring a really good point up. Victim blaming, victim shaming, and overall society seriously needs a rehaul in how they think. So, for example, when societies are saying, well, you wore this and you were out at this time and this is why you were raped. Instead of saying, concerning and policing what you're saying, whom you're speaking to, and how you're dressing, the research completely debunks that. Has nothing to do with that. You could be, literally in a snowsuit and people will still talk to you and approach you, right? So it's about looking at the perpetrators. Having said that, if you can't get support from your primary caretakers, there are other adults. There's befrienders that you can call. It's a 24-hour hotline. Maybe a religious figure in your church, your mosque, your temple, a trusted teacher. And, a lot of schools are equipped with counselors. So it's important, maybe a best friend's mom. Even online, it's not all bad, of course. It's how we use it. Can have important resources. So it's good to get support from somewhere.
This morning on Mind Matters, we're discussing how parents and children can empower themselves to deal with, the threat of those who groom online. Coming up next, can people who, I guess, share characteristics like these be reformed? That's what we're going to ask next on Lite. So in light of recent stories of grooming happening through chat apps, this morning we're discussing how parents and children can empower themselves to deal with these threats.
Okay, now looking at the specific story that we've been reading about in the papers, just recently the perpetrator claims that this is just, he's friendly, he likes to make friends, and he's been doing this for years because there's no harm in it. Okay, so can someone with these tendencies who likes to, I suppose, approach young children for quote-unquote friendship, can they be reformed, Dr. Anjhula?
So in psychology, we know, a lot of times people speak in the language of reformation or cure, and usually really there's no such thing. It's about being better adapted, better adjusted. It's sort of, we think more along the lines of being on a spectrum. So there might be a lifelong tendency to, for example, have these thoughts, but then it's just managed in a much, much better way. So in terms of the diagnostic criteria for pedophilia, it involves various things, but usually it's defined as someone who has arousals or sexual fantasies and tendencies that either you act upon with, prepubescent kids, so, a young person that's under 13, or such strong urges that it actually affects, your occupation or, other important areas of life. Can you be reformed? Like I said, again, we don't look at it as in terms of reformation, but definitely you can be helped. There's various approaches. Some are sort of biophysical, others are a cognitive approach, but in combination, there's medicines that you can take that reduce testosterone. We know that pedophilia is largely men rather than women. So there are medicines that you can take sometimes that are offered for depression, but they're, given in dosages that are much larger than you would for depression, that sort of clamp down on the sexual desire. So that really helps. And then also the therapeutic part where, empathy training. You can actually watch videos of the victims and see it from their perspective. Aversion training, for example, where a therapist can pump a foul smell at the same time as having an image of a child. So you connect the two to be aversive. You don't want to go anywhere near there. So there's a lot of approaches that can help keep it at bay.
Right. And who are these pedophiles?
Hard to say, but I will definitely encourage society to rethink that can't happen to me, it happens elsewhere outside, because we know research-based that very, very commonly it happens with family, friends, and relatives, because they have the easiest access. So I'm not asking everyone to be suspicious, but I'm asking everyone to be aware, to trust, but verify.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Anjhula.
Pleasure.
Okay. And that's Mind Matters for today. If you want to listen to the full podcast, you can go to lite.my after 10 a.m.